So working with our MVC design pattern, the first part of MVC that we're going to be tackling is the model layer. So we're going to take a look at how we're able to create the model layer, and more specifically the service and persistence layer, using a Liferay tool called Service Builder. So let's take a look at that. So let's first talk about what exactly is Service Builder. So Service Builder is a code generation tool that we at Liferay have created. What Service Builder allows us to do is build services, as the name sort of implies. But the way it's done is actually pretty cool. So what we end up doing is we're given a specific XML file. And this XML file is called service.xml. It's there with that XML file that we describe our entities that we want to create. So we want to create an assignment and a submission. So what does that look like in the database? What type of services do we want to use? And so on and so on. Service Builder will take that XML file. It'll generate all of the service layer code, all of the persistence layer code, all of the caching code, and it'll also give us some of the some default implementations for some common operations, our CRUD methods in this case. So it'll include how to add, delete, update an assignment, as well as the submission and many other things. Right. And so this is very nifty, very quick to use. Right. Once we get accustomed with it, you can literally create your model layer in a few minutes. Right. So pretty cool. Right. And a lot of services, or I should say, and the services are created as well. We're talking about not only local services, but remote or web services are created. So you don't have to use Service Builder if you don't want to. At the very least, we want to expose you guys to Service Builder so you know how Liferay has generated its own services. But we also encourage you to use this tool as well, since it has done us a lot of good things. So some of the features of Service Builder. Behind the scenes, Service Builder is using Spring and Hibernate. In regards to the services, all of the services that we create using Service Builder are OSGi services. So what we learned about how to create, instantiate, call OSGi services are the same with the services we generate with Service Builder. So the knowledge of OSGi is still following us. Alongside of those nifty things, Service Builder also allows us to customize the database schema that we're working with. We can add our own business logic. We are also able to connect or bring in external data sources. We can do things like tune the cache, and we can also create some dynamic or custom SQL queries as well. So not only does it do a lot for us, there's a lot of things we can do with Service Builder. So when we go through the ideas of Service Builder, these are going to be the big ideas, the high-level basic concepts that we're going to be going through. Again, we talked about service.xml. This is the first step. We describe the entity that we want to work with. There's going to be another file called portlet-model-hints. It provides a way for us to kind of further configure our different database model columns. So we might have a column that's a string, but we want it displayed a specific way in the UI. Portlet-model-hints helps us with that. We'll take a look at how do we create, or what our local services look like, what our remote services look like, and how do we add our own business logic or change up the implementation of the services that are created by Service Builder. Again, Service Builder will do its best to give us the kind of defaults or the generics, but we can take it a step further and do some additional customization. We'll take a look at finders and how we're able to find our assignments or our submissions based on specific parameters. We'll look at service wrappers as well as service context as well. So let's first start off service.xml. So service.xml, this is where we describe our entity. And so the way we do so is we basically are going to define each column that represents our assignment. So our assignment may have an assignment ID number, a name, a creation date, and so on. And so that's what we're going to be defining within service.xml. On top of that, there are a bunch of other things that service.xml is going to do for us. How do we want to get our assignments, our entities? How do we want to order them? What types of services are we going to use, local or remote? Is this going to be coming from Liferay's database or an outside database? And we can see kind of the list goes on and on. But for the time being, the basics, the fundamentals of Service Builder is that we get to tell Liferay what our assignments and what our submissions are going to be looking like. Once we do that, we're going to run a Gradle task called build service. Build service is going to generate a whole bunch of code. It's going to generate all of our service layer code, our persistence layer code, and and even our SQL statements as well. So it'll also help us create the database too, or at least our database table. So over here is an example of service.xml. So starting off at what would be the second line, with a lot of XML files, we have the DTD. And so we can take a look at the DTD if you want and kind of see what's fair game within this service.xml. As we go down, the part that I want to emphasize first is that entity local service equals true line. So we're saying here, we're going to have an entity whose name is blogs entry. We're going to have local services as well as remote services. So we set both of those equal to true. So from there, we just kind of go at it and describe our blogs entry. So the primary key, it'll have an entry ID of type long. We'll have a group ID of type long, and kind of on and on and on, just listing off what are the different columns we want for this blogs entry, what are the attributes of this specific entity. All right, so that's part one, service.xml. Again, as a recap, helps us create our entities by allowing us to define what our entities look like. It'll create the services to manipulate the entity. It'll create SQL statements to create that table within their database. Next up is portlet-model-hints. So portlet-model-hints is a way in which we can kind of further customize our SQL columns. So we can have our entry ID field, for example, of type long. And if we want to do some additional configuration of this field, this is where we can do so in portlet-model-hints. Okay, so in this example here, you can see the field name title is type string. But maybe, we don't want our end user just to hold down, the H key, and then it spans for hundreds, maybe thousands of characters, right? And so in this situation here, we're saying the maximum length of this field is going to be 150 characters, right? So you can do things like that. You can say, oh, instead of single line, maybe I want a text area instead. Portlet-model-hints allows us to have those types of configurations. So here we have the max length of 150. We have the contents sanitized, and we also added a validator to the field as well. So kind of some cool things there. So local and remote services. So we have service.xml, portlet-model-hints, and once we run Service Builder and it checks out our service.xml, it'll then generate our local and remote services based off of whether or not we want them or not. All right, so local services, remote services, service.xml is where we can say we want one or the other, logical or. So you can have one, the other, or both. All right. So local services are just that. These are services that we're able to call within Liferay, or more specifically, call within the same JVM. So when we're going through local services, typically we're not going to do any sort of access control or permission checking. So for example, we have a service to delete our assignment. If it's a local service, we're typically not doing permission checking or access control within that local service. So if someone kind of snakes their way into Liferay and calls the delete assignment local service, it's going to be a little bit troublesome, but we'll talk about how do we protect our services pretty soon. So local service, local to Liferay, within the same JVM is when we can call this service. It's through these services that we can manipulate or do things to our entity or call the persistence layer to help us out. Remote services, these are the services that are called outside of Liferay, so outside of the JVM that we're in right now. So remote services are where our permission checking is going to be. And though it sounds a little bit funny, we typically use it, you can use it locally. So what you can do is have your controller class call a remote service, and it's in that remote service that we do the permission checking. Do you have the proper roles and permissions to do what you're trying to do? And if so, then yeah, you can do that. But classically, right, remote services are web services that we expose to outside of Liferay. So maybe a third-party application or, something else, something in between. So as we see here, right, remote services typically serve as a facade, a way for us to do permission checking. So remote services will do permission checking and then call the local service afterwards. Right. So this is the big idea. This is the way we use remote services most of the time. But again, these are also our web services. So Service Builder and OSGi. So when we're creating services using Service Builder, this is going to be done with some OSGi flair to it. So when we use the @reference annotation, this is still going to work in our controller class. So when we reference the services generated by Service Builder, all is good, no worries there. But when we are in the service class itself, this is where we cannot use the @reference annotation. Right, since we have Spring behind the scenes helping us out to reference services within our service class, we need to use the @service reference or Spring's @bean reference instead of the @reference within the OSGi world. So outside of service classes, we do the same thing we've always done. Inside of service classes, we need to use either @service or the @bean reference. So @service reference, @bean reference. Now the implementation class. We talk about how Liferay goes through and adds some default implementation for a lot of the common operations we would go through. Now if we want to add our own business logic or override some of those implementations, this is where we have the opportunity to do so. So Service Builder creates those implementation classes for us. Within the implementation classes, right, there's a bunch of different things that it does. There's an implementation class for remote services as well as local services, assuming we generate both of them. Now, when we're modifying our services, or I should say, when we're modifying our Service Builder services, the only class that we really need to modify is these implementation classes. Right? We modify the implementation classes, we rerun Service Builder, and Service Builder will see the changes and then update everything that needs to be updated. So it works a little bit backwards. Instead of working on the API and then implementing what changes you've made, you'll work on the implementation, and Service Builder will then update the API as well as everything else. All right, so finders. Finders are ways in which we can query the database, right? I want to find my assignments based off of something, whatever that something may be. And so we have the ability to say that. I want to find my assignments based off of a student's name or the creation date, or you name it. You can make that happen with a finder. So finders come in two different types, right? We have regular finders, which do not do permission checking, and then we have filter finders. This is where permission checking takes place. So filter finders, right, those are only generated if permissioning is enabled. On top of that, finders, like we said, can be customized. So we have a lot of control over how to find our entities. Service wrappers. So service wrappers are a way in which we can override services within Liferay. We'll discuss more of this a little bit later, but within our Service Builder created Liferay modules, we have the Gradebook API and the Gradebook service. So Service Builder creates kind of a stub, or kind of a default wrapper that's just there, right? And so the wrapper classes generated in the API module. And again, these wrapper classes can be used to override or even extend the services created by Service Builder. So let's say, we mess with the implementation, and then from there, maybe we want to keep that implementation. So if someone wants to make kind of a one-off while keeping the implementation, they can do so using a service wrapper. Okay, and then service context, so this is the sort of summation of a bunch of different information, like permissions, tagging, and metadata or categorization. So Service Builder caching. So when we are caching, we're going to be using Liferay's built-in caching system. So there are three different layers, or three different levels of caching. We have the entity, we have the finder, and then we have Hibernate, who's going to do some caching for us as well. Behind the scenes, Liferay is using EHCache as its implementation for a caching mechanism. So we have our first two layers of caching dealt with in Hibernate. We have level 1 and level 2. Level 1 is what's used to cache objects that are coming from the database, or what we have retrieved from the database, and it's working with the current session that we have. So whenever Liferay's service layer makes requests to maybe get specific objects, this is where our level 1 caching can occur. Level 2 is going across the whole database session, and this is where our database objects are going to be storing its cache for the results of their queries. So we have entity cache and query cache in level 2. So all of that to say is Service Builder, has its own custom cache in which we are making all of these things happen for the entity and the query cache. So because we have this whole custom cache, Hibernate's level 2 cache is disabled by default. So that way we kind of avoid redundancy. So pretty big, a lot of concepts. Let's go ahead and summarize all of this up. We start off by asking Liferay Workspace, or Blade, to create a service builder project for us. Within that service builder project, we're going to have a file called service.xml. It's within service.xml that we define our entity and the attributes of the entity, as well as things like how to look for it and how does it get ordered. Once we do that, we run Service Builder, where Service Builder will read our service.xml, create all of the service classes necessary for us to manipulate, add, delete our entity, and it'll also create the SQL statements for our entity so we can store it within the database. Right. Our Service Builder architecture looks a little something like this. So from a web browser, we'll start off on the left. And if you want, you can make web service calls using JSON, for example. JSON will call the service layer, hits that remote service. If there's any modifications there, we'll call the wrapper first. If no modifications, we call the remote service layer. Permission checking occurs, and typically the remote service is going to call the local service. Local service then calls the persistence layer to ask the persistence layer to do exactly what we're trying to do, and then it'll manipulate the database in doing so. That's over on the JSON side. If we go through the application itself, it's very similar. Right? So the browser, we hit our portlet or our application. The application makes an action request, for example, and within that action request, it's going to make a service call. Service call can either hit remote or local, depending on how we want to configure it. We'll hit remote if we want to do permission checking. We'll hit local if permission checking is not that big of a deal. So we'll first check the local service wrapper. Are we going to do any sort of one-offs? We'll then call the local service. Local service calls the persistence layer to, again, do what we need to do. Now, using Service Builder. So when we are doing this on our own, we can again follow the tasks that we kind of outlined. This is a little bit more thorough. So we create that Service Builder project. We define our entities, our Finder queries, and so on within service.xml. We run Service Builder. Once we run Service Builder, it'll give us the implementation class that we need, and then we will make any modifications to the implementation. Once we make modifications to the implementation, we rerun Service Builder. Once we rerun Service Builder, we can do additional tweaking, and any tweaking that we do, we always want to run Service Builder again to pick up those changes. So when do we rerun Service Builder? Let's be a little bit more thorough. So anytime we modify service.xml, we rerun Service Builder. Right? Anytime we modify our service implementation classes, we will rerun Service Builder as well. So those are kind of the two big high levels of when to rerun Service Builder. So when we are working with our implementation classes, Liferay recommends that when we're doing our typical CRUD operations, for example, that we follow this specific pattern. So our entity, when we are working with our implementation, it follows this pattern. Entity name followed by service impl if it's remote, or entity name followed by local service impl if it's local. In this example, we can see with the add or create, we want to pass a number of different parameters. So the user ID, the person who's creating it, the group ID, right? This is the ID number of the site, all of the fields that we are working with for that specific entity, and then this service context object. When we are updating, we want to pass the primary key, all of the entity fields of our entity or model object, and then our service context as well. And then finally, when we delete our entity, we just need to pass the primary key. So disabling generated service methods, right? And so sometimes we might be modifying our implementation methods or just our methods in general. right? If we want to sort of deprecate, quote unquote, a specific method, this is how we can do so. What we would do is, with the old method, we would have an unsupported operation exception thrown with a message saying call this other one, the new one instead. Whew. So again, a lot of content here. Let's go ahead. We're going to be working on an exercise in which we create the service layer for our gradebook assignment. So let's take a look at the various steps that we're going to be walking through. So the steps here, as we've outlined before, we're going to create a Liferay workspace project with the template of Service Builder. We'll modify our service.xml to define our entities. We'll run Service Builder. We'll make some modifications to the logic if need be, rerun Service Builder again, make some tweaks, deploy and test, and every time we make some sort of modification, we'll be sure to rerun Service Builder. So let's go ahead and we'll take a look at creating a Service Builder project.